produce and process and distribute and consume and dispose of our food. And what's important to understand about our food system is that our food system is a racial project. It's not separate from the whole world of racism that we live in. Race and class really greatly shape the production and the distribution and the consumption of our food. And so the work of food justice is addressing the ways that racism and class oppression have distorted our food system, and doing that so that everyone can have access to healthy food, to culturally appropriate food, and so that our food is produced in ways that are good for consumers and workers and the environment. So it's a huge umbrella that can look like a lot of things. That can look like, improving farm worker conditions, environmental sustainability in agriculture, addressing indigenous or building indigenous land sovereignty, addressing Black land dispossession, thinking about the effects that colonialism and gentrification have on local food cultures. All types of things really fall under this umbrella of food justice and food injustice. And that's at a local scale, the national scale, and really importantly at the international scale as well. And so I want to talk about what food justice activism is looking like here in DC these days. And again, so much of the food activism here in DC is seeking to address these root causes of food injustice in the region. And for me, the main root cause, again, is racial capitalism. It's a social and economic system that creates disproportionate vulnerability to premature death for Black people and people of color. And so a lot of the food activism in DC is really addressing the ways that food intersects with that system. So in recent years, there's been a lot of activation around the issue of food apartheid. Food apartheid is a system of segregation. So food apartheid is creating geographic barriers to accessing healthy food. It is, hey, we do not have enough places to buy fresh food here in Ward 8, for example. And these are folks marching in 2017 at the grocery walk, which is really building attention around this issue and demanding solutions to it. And at the root of food apartheid is residential segregation that was really built by Jim Crow. Also connected to that history of segregation is the current activism among street food vendors in DC. So these are some folks protesting, I think in 2020, about the ways that street vendors in neighborhoods like Columbia Heights, for example, are very heavily policed in terms of their ability to be able to take up space in the city and to be on the street. And so there was actually yesterday, I think everybody just missed it, but yesterday was the last day to submit testimony around really decriminalizing street vending in DC. So hoping for some good outcomes around that in the new year. You might have seen news coverage about a recent ballot referendum to eliminate the tip minimum wage. This was a campaign led by restaurant workers, so also part of food justice, who were fighting to be paid the full minimum wage. And it took a lot of years for them to win this campaign because they're fighting back against a wage system that, again, can be traced directly back to slavery and efforts to avoid paying recently freed African Americans for their labor. And so, again, these are some different aspects of food justice, but for the rest of my presentation, I'm really going to focus on the food justice issue of food access. So these are some folks a long time ago, I don't know, maybe 2016, who were doing some food access advocacy in the Wilson Building. And DC has a long history of Washingtonians organizing around access to food. And to think about that, we could start at any time, but I'm going to start in the late 60s and the early 70s when poor Black women in DC were leaders in the national welfare rights movement, fighting for dignified treatment, fighting for the recognition of the value of their labor as mothers and fighting for a right to income. So women like Berry Farms resident Etta Horn were early proponents of the idea of universal basic income. And what they were doing was really like a follow-up, a successor to the civil rights movement, which we know accomplished so much, but didn't really reach the goal of building a more just economic system, of changing the institutions and the policies and the laws that create American poverty and racialized wealth inequality. And so unfortunately, it was quite the opposite. This time where you see Etta Horn, so Etta Horn is the woman on the left. When you see Etta Horn marching, this is a time where promises made during the war on poverty are being rolled back. So for example, huge effort to cut back at things like food stamp benefits. The progress of the civil rights movement was being contested. And so just really a assault followed in the wake of the civil rights movement against some of these policies that had successfully decreased hunger in America. So this is kind of the moment, maybe a few years after that, is where Bread for the City would enter this story. So in 1974, Zacchaeus Free Clinic was established. And then in 1976, the original version of Bread for the City. And they were really founded by people who wanted to extend the work that folks like Etta Horn were doing to create a city where food was a human right. And this moment in the 70s was in some ways similar to our own high inflation. Okay, we all felt that. Rising rates of homelessness. This is just a few years after the 1968 uprising, so widespread protests against racial oppression. And so in this moment where these two precursors to what we know as Bread for the City today were founded, they were really pioneers in terms of the food nonprofit sector here in DC. The creation of these two organizations marks a time where this type of work in the city was moving away from an older settlement house charity model, which was basically rich white ladies like set up these houses, and they would be like, hey, we're going to help either low-income white people or low-income people of color become better citizens and learn how to better manage their lives because that's what's wrong with them. And we're going to do that by like modeling good culture and things like that. And so Zacchaeus Free Clinic, Bread for the City is a departure from that model of charity in the city. They were both coming from faith-based organizers, but also activist-based organizing. And so Zacchaeus Free Clinic, for example, was an outgrowth of something called CCNV, group called a Center for Creative Nonviolence. And these folks were anti-war activists. They were pressing again for the ideas of food and housing as human rights, dignified treatment for people experiencing food insecurity, and policy change. They were like, this is not a cultural issue, right? It's not something wrong with people experiencing poverty. This is about, this is an issue of political will. This is a policy issue. So CCNV is pretty badass. They did a lot of great stuff in the city around housing, but also food. So this is a picture of them in 1983, I think, where they went all the way to Kansas City and protested the fact that the US government at the time was basically hoarding like millions of pounds of government cheese in these underground caves. So they went to Kansas City, they did a hunger strike for a month and demanded that the government begin releasing this cheese again to people. So these are, the folks who founded one of these main predecessor organizations to Bread for the City. And then during the early 1990s, the two organizations came together to work on a program that was helping folks apply for public benefits. And again, now we're in the late 80s, early 90s, there's a full assault, right, on these benefits. And it's increasingly difficult for people to be able to access these services. And so that's what really brought these two organizations together to fund to form what we know as Bread for the City today. And then in 1991, they added legal services as well, recognizing that that was access to legal services also played a role in people being able to access those public health benefits. So moving into, well, going back a little bit, I guess, to the 1980s, we see the rest of the foundational DC food profits that we know today are born all within 1 decade. So Capital Area Food Bank in 1979, that's Miriam Berry at the ribbon cutting ceremony of the Capital Area Food Bank, Martha's Table in 1980, Food and Friends in 1988, DC Central Kitchen, 1989. And so why are all these organizations founded at the same time? Again, it's because there was, in the early 20th century, this social safety net is set up, right, to prevent or lessen the extent to which people would fall into food insecurity, fall into poverty. And then we see that social safety net very much cut around the times that these organizations are founded. So they're really founded to fill in for the gaps that are created in that moment. But in addition to really doing that direct service work and getting food to people who needed it, we also are seeing these organizations do really important advocacy and policy work. So we have Bread for the City pushing housing and healthcare policy. We have Food and Friends, which started as a mutual aid group for people with HIV and AIDS, successfully getting healthy food to be included as part of AIDS legislation at that time. DC Central Kitchen designing ways to feed people and prevent food waste and create jobs at the same time. So again, while these organizations are getting food to people, they're also trying to address root causes. They're also trying to reshape the infrastructure of our food system. So what makes, thinking about that ecosystem today, a lot of these organizations are still here, right? Along with some newer organizations. And what I will say is, although most of the organizations really started out with these activist roots, that did fall off, at some point, and we did see some returns more closer to the traditional charity model. But Bread for the City has really been an important part of re-energizing, bringing back energy around this important combination of direct service with advocacy and policy work. And so, again, when you look at all these different organizations in recent years, there's been a really important turn back to their activist and advocacy roots, with the recognition that food security on the global, national, local scale is not a problem of resources, but a problem of political will. And that meeting people's immediate needs is crucial, but must be accompanied by long-term changes to our food system and our economic system and our political system. And Bread has really, in our city, led the way in working to have that advocacy also be more client-led. And again, continuing to disrupt the charity dynamics that can pervade the nonprofit industry. So these are pictures of some folks from Bread's Client Advisory Council, one of whom I've had the privilege to work with. And then another thing I wanted to highlight that makes Bread really important in this ecosystem is the ways that the organization is working to address several different root causes of poverty at once. So recognizing the ways that food, economic, health, housing, and legal justice are deeply tied together, and the ways that marginalization and exploitation in these arenas reinforce each other. So if you don't have a stable place to live, it's much harder to store and prepare food. If you don't have sufficient income, you're less likely to secure stable housing. If you're marginalized in the legal system, that jeopardizes your income, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And all of these forms of oppression can lead to decreased health and decreased life expectancy. And then on the flip side, supporting people and building more just food systems simultaneously in all these areas can create the conditions for people to thrive. And so that's something that Bread has been doing since the jump. So food access in DC today, here is a graph looking at how wage levels have changed. So you can see that higher income and even middle income folks in our region, their wages have returned mostly to pre-pandemic levels, whereas low income earners, their wages have not returned. The pandemic has exacerbated wealth inequality and racial wealth inequality as well. 33% 1 out of 3 DC residents are food insecure today, half of those being severely food insecure. 50% of Black residents in the DC region experiencing food insecurity, and 2/3 of households with children of color in that household. And so the work of Bread and all of these organizations in this ecosystem continue to be really important. We're still struggling with food insecurity in our region, and we still have a lot more work to do to dismantle those root causes. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Dominique. As you were reading through the presentation, the term food justice came up, but I wondered what are some of the other terms that are out there and the nuances between terms like food justice, food apartheid, food insecurity, and then how can we develop a framework with language that better frames the root causes, given that we have all this conversation around the terminology?
Yeah, that's a great question, Chris. I mean, and that's why I do like the term food apartheid. I think the main obstacle with that term is everybody's not heard of it yet, but in many ways it's replaced a term like food deserts, which, they're both describing the same thing, which is in communities across the country, people don't, they live too far, from a place to get fresh food, and especially from a full service place like a grocery store, for example. But what food apartheid does is kind of highlight those root causes. It is front and center saying, hey, this is a system of racial segregation, and it's something that is born out of policy choices. It's something that's born out of the structure of our society. It's not like a natural occurrence, like a desert. So I think that's why terms like that are really important. Another term I'll throw in there, is food sovereignty, which is kind of representing what would be the flip side of food injustice, I guess. Like if everybody had food sovereignty, and what's embedded in that word is power. If you have food sovereignty, that means you have power over your food. That means you have power with your neighbors and being able to choose, grow, buy, sell, disseminate the food that your community wants and needs. So I definitely think the terminologies that we use are important and can obscure or illuminate the root causes.
Got it. Thank you so much. And shout out to Karen Washington, the founder of Bugs and a farmer who coined that term. Let's talk a little bit more about what we're doing at the policy level within the mayor's office. What is the mayor's administration doing to increase food access and food security in Ward 7 and Ward 8? And how are partnering nonprofits able to achieve the mayor's food policy priorities?
Thanks, Chris. And on that last point about terms too, just want to highlight the Food Policy Council's terms guide, which we created last year and we're updating right now. That is our attempt to kind of like standardize the language that people are using about the food system in DC, and particularly calls out using terms like food apartheid instead of food desert. I think also I've learned a lot from Dominique's work about really like how recent like there are people alive today in DC who are like longtime DC residents who remember when there were local stores in their neighborhood selling fresh food, and that the term food desert, in addition to all the reasons Dominique mentioned that it's problematic, also kind of sounds like something that is like inevitable and was always there rather than like by design in the last 50 years. So I can put a link to that in the chat later. So thanks, Chris, for the opportunity to talk about some of what the city's doing. The mayor has a really ambitious food access priority within her administration. We're going into the third term now. I think particularly because of COVID, the issue of food access in the city was really, I think, like brought into stark contrast, particularly when public transportation was more limited. People were understandably fearful of like traveling far to go to a large grocery store. And when we received the American Rescue Plan Act dollars from the federal government, the mayor made an unprecedented investment, $58 million into a new food access fund, which is for full service grocery stores and sit down restaurants east of the river. In addition to creating the Nourish DC collaborative, which the Food Policy Council advocated for really strongly. So kind of my personal favorite, which is specifically targeted at local DC resident-owned food businesses serving their own communities. And we provide grants, loans, and technical assistance with our partners who are implementing the fund, like Capital Impact Partners and Dreaming Out Loud. I think I also wanted to highlight that we've changed the supermarket tax incentives over the last few years to be a lot more targeted to the neighborhoods that we know need more fresh food. In the last budget, we changed the eligibility criteria so that the supermarkets getting the tax incentive are really in the neighborhoods that we want to be investing in most. And the mayor would probably want me to mention, some of the progress. Lidl in Ward 7 just opened earlier this year. Giant is coming to the Capitol Gateway site. Good Food Markets opened in Bellevue last year. And is now shifting to a new model, but I think the city's still really invested in supporting them and staying open. And then, just wanting to call out the difference between food access and food insecurity to this theme about using proper terms. You could have a grocery store on every block and still not solve food insecurity. It's really important. Food access is an important part of food insecurity. But food insecurity, as Dominique mentioned, is really about poverty, it's about racism. And so looking at the city's investments in things like making our public benefit programs more accessible. I think the city's done some really good work in the last few years, piloting online SNAP. So SNAP customers can now spend their SNAP dollars online. We're moving WIC finally to eWIC. So it'll be EBT cards rather than paper vouchers, which will make it easier for WIC customers to make several shopping trips in a month rather than having to spend their paper voucher in one trip. It decreases stigma. It's all in all a much stronger program. And then there's also the suite of DC Health grant programs for healthy food access. So those include some programs really popular with DC residents, Produce Plus, which you can spend at farmers markets, Joyful Food Markets, which is like a farmers market style, free food distribution in schools, Healthy Corners stores, and home delivered meals out of food and funds. So I think I answered your question. I don't want to keep going on, but let me know if I missed something.
Yeah, well, I wanted to circle back to, the notion of nuance in all of this work, because you mentioned the new Lidl that opened, but you also said that food, just the establishment of a grocery store in and of itself doesn't necessarily get at the challenges of food insecurity, nor the root causes in many instances. Can we talk a little bit more about how that circumstance can exist, and what can we do to fashion better policies that actually advance community economic development and wealth building versus establishing, foreign-based companies where the wealth is extracted and then transported to Berlin? Literally.
Yes, literally. Thanks, Chris. It's a great question. I think, now we're going to go into my personal opinion, but I think there's it can't just be one solution. When I talk to residents want big box grocery stores. They want options, So I think to be able to deliver on what the mayor has promised, I think having that option for every neighborhood is important. And we don't currently at least have, a local big box grocery chain that could fit that need. But my office, and as you know, the Food Policy Council has been really focused on okay, we got that down. There's city investment going towards big box store attraction. So now how can we give residents also the dignity of choice and the choice to be able to spend money on organizations and businesses in their own neighborhood? And that's where programs like Nourish DC come in. We're currently looking at ways to invest more money in the farmers markets that are currently operating east of the river to be able to provide more choice there. So, I think like if I think about my ideal food system in terms of food access, at least it's one in which like no matter where you live in the city, you're able to like think about like the place you want to spend your money that day. It could be a corner store, it could be a farmer's market, it could be a big box store. So I hope that gets to your question. And the food access versus food insecurity thing is also a lot about affordability, which I don't think we've quite cracked the nut on. Like smaller stores end up being more expensive just because of like economies of scale. It's a lot easier for Costco to get like a really low price option. So that's something, I think we're really continuing to think about. And if anyone has any ideas, I'd love to talk more.
I do have ideas and we can talk more. But I wanted to circle back to Dominique. Let's go back to the economic security piece. During your presentation, you really laid out a history of the circumstances that continue to compound themselves and really make that economic security piece more distant for many district residents. Can you tell us more about how that has evolved, what some of the solutions might be, and how communities have worked to address those things over the course of time in different ways?
Yeah, sure. And I think, this ties into the previous question as well. And, I would agree that kind of in a healthy food system, everyone would have access to these choices of the, corner store, farmers market, big box, smaller, perhaps co-op, and also the money, the resources to be able to get the food that you want from those establishments. And it has to almost happen at the same time, both that food insecurity and the food access pieces. I think we saw that with efforts to build up farmers markets east of the river. I mean, to really jumpstart things, something like the Produce Plus program was necessary to really redistribute wealth and income in the city and put money, in people's hands that they could use to buy the food. When we look historically, there's been all different types of things that folks in the city have used to address both the geographic access problem and the food insecurity problem, and also both of them together. So, oh gosh, where would I start? I mean, on the food insecurity, piece, as I was saying in the presentation, DC in the 60s and 70s was kind of a center of folks who were pushing for this more larger scale avenues of wealth redistribution, and particularly to close the racial wealth gap, like as a form of reparations. And there's still people in the city pushing for that today as well. Cooperative economic development in the 70s, DC was also known as one of the co-op capitals of the country, where people were honestly trying to try their hand at building like a different economic system and building things like there's so many of them, like home rule. There's a co-op called home rule. There's one called MLK Co-op, which was in the Arthur Caper Apartments, and that was about so many things. It was about having the stores employ people from the neighborhood. It was about building a cooperative economy. So the co-op stores would buy their groceries from co-ops. So they're, if you bought a can of pepper, it was from a can of pepper, it was from a spice co-op, right? So supporting people at these levels. And it was also about affordability. It was about food, is the point of food is not to make the most profit possible. The point is for folks to be able to eat and for farmers and producers to be able to produce food. And so through these cooperative efforts, folks were also able to increase the affordability of their food. And as you know, Chris, there's people today in the city also still trying to harness that method of cooperative economic development as a means to food justice.
Thank you so much. Something else that Ona mentioned previously came back into my mind as you were going through the cooperative movement, and kind of the connections between policy and resources at the both national level and federal level, and here in our municipal DC level. And I wondered, Ona, if you could go back a little bit more and help us better understand ARPA money versus what's in the city budget and how we can work to make some of the investments made one time with ARPA more consistent and structural within the district's budget.
Sure. So ARPA, the American Rescue Plan money that came down from the federal government does have some parameters on it. So it's one time, although we are able to spend it over 3 years. Yes. So, you know, a lot of the programs like the Food Access Fund and Nourish, you know, we're able to at least be able to plan 3 years out. And yes, that is different than the local budget, right? So the local budget is based largely on taxpayer dollars. You know, I think there's a lot of like misunderstanding in DC that DC is like mostly funded by federal dollars, which is inaccurate. Like the federal money coming into the city is a minority of the funding we're spending, and it's also earmarked for very specific causes. Like the vast majority of it is for Medicaid and Medicare. The local budget is something that the mayor and the council debate every year, how to spend it. And, you know, not going into too many details about that process. You know, the mayor proposes a budget every year that comes out in March, and then the council spends between March and May moving some of that money around, deciding, you know, to what extent they agree with the mayor's investments, to what extent they want to change it. And, you know, then that's the final budget. So I think in terms of advocacy on the local level, particularly for projects that are currently funded by ARPA, it would really be like twofold advocacy. The first would be making the argument to the mayor and to the agencies that the programs that got this like one-time influx of money deserve to like have that continued funding. You know, hopefully ARPA actually comes with very strict reporting requirements. So I think there'll be very strong data and evidence on like what has been effective, and, you know, making the argument that those should continue. And then, you know, same with the DC Council going to budget oversight hearings, performance oversight hearings. I mean, that is where like these decisions are being made, and anybody can go testify at those hearings, DC resident or not. I think that starts to answer your question. You know, the local funds are finite. So, you know, the like debate is like where it goes, and we do have a lot of city priorities. And sometimes, you know, I will say, I think food doesn't rise to like the top level in the same way that like housing and homelessness, crime tend to, you know, education tend to harness a lot of like really big budget dollars. So I think, you know, as an advocacy community, we still have work to do to really make the case of like the food system as like a very integral part of resident well-being. Got it.
Thank you. Thank you. So our organizers and activists out there, you got a little bit of insight on some of our next steps. And if there's any chiefs of staff or council members listening, we'll be come knocking on y'all's door. But another question is, what is the role of philanthropy and all of this mix? And Dominique had a question and some comments in that regard.
Yes, well, I have a question for our moderator, Chris. So, you know, Chris, Dreaming Out Loud was not in my presentation because it's one of the newer food justice organizations in the city. But I think that newer crop of organizations have been shaking things up, pushing for a lot of changes, and that includes in the realm of philanthropy. So my question for you is kind of, what do you wish was different, or what do you hope to see in terms of the evolution of philanthropy and how they're engaging with food organizations?
Yes, so I think that philanthropy has an important role to play, but defining that role is now at this cross section, this inflection point is really important. Philanthropy should be the one to take a risk. As Ona was describing what the role of government and various sets of resources from either the federal or the district level might be, she used a word that's really important, that's restriction, right? Philanthropy has more freedom to utilize resources in a way that's not restrictive on the organizations and communities that are doing the work deeply and need the flexibility. Going back to what I said about risk, yeah, we're working to solve things that are the result of systems that create challenges that really need correction in the billions and trillions. So reparations for Black folks, the United Nations says that we are owed $14 trillion. So a $1 million food access fund grant doesn't really put a drop in the bucket in relation to what the scale of the actual root cause challenge is. But that being said, when you have that deep of a challenge, only being able to move in a certain way or use the resources in a certain way makes it even more challenging. And philanthropy can help to navigate or give you flexibility around restricted resources and take risks where the free market is not able to address that need. Folks who are, capitalists or free market evangelists and those type of folks think that everything can be solved by a new business, and sometimes it cannot be and should not be, because it's beyond the moral and ethical realm of the market. And I think philanthropy has a role to play in that regard. I think philanthropy can be flexible in terms of reporting. That was another word that you utilized, Ona. Reporting that is onerous, that takes us away from the business of advocating for the committing of resources towards this greater challenge is really important. And so being able to free up time to be able to commit to continuing the work is important. And I think that philanthropy can be more radical in the way that they distribute resources up to and including spending down and straight transferring wealth. So many of the challenges that I see day to day are just one of purely having the resources to wait on a certain thing to open up at a certain moment when you can take advantage of it. And that's what, you see venture capitalists and startups do, right? We see food enterprises and initiatives within the community fail because they don't have the resources to wait out, whatever, payback period or break even point might be. Uber doesn't have that problem. It's not profitable because they just have billions of dollars. Sweetgreen lost like $300 million last year, but you don't see a Sweetgreen shutting down, right? So these are the issues of resource distribution, and philanthropy can play a role in helping to facilitate conversations, just redistribute resources, take risks, and help us advance this whole cause of justice and food justice and ending food apartheid further.
I'm like, as I was listening to Chris, Dominique, I'm thinking about what you were talking about these nonprofits moving from like a very like activism foundation, like kind of away from that in the past few decades, dreaming out loud aside. And also wondering like what the role of philanthropy was in that, because like my observation is that like philanthropy is like much more interested in paying for food distribution than it is for like pushing the boundaries of like paying for like an advocacy director, like figuring out that gray line of like, you can't pay for lobbying, but like, what can you pay for in the activist space? And I wonder if like that, the philanthropy world almost like pulled these nonprofits away from those activist roots.
Absolutely, yeah. As these organizations become more institutionalized into the 90s to the 99s and 2000s, that's absolutely what happened. And especially, again, when you look at how they started out as either activist groups or mutual aid efforts, and then once they become funded by philanthropy, also by government, these changes happen. It becomes more professionalized, there's more rigidity, and then also the actual work of the organizations become more conservative, and conservative meaning not focused on changing the systems and addressing the root causes. And so I think this ties into a question from KM in the chat, which is, what's the role of nonprofits like Bread in enacting our activist spirit to hold the city council and government accountable? And my answer to that is I would like to see these nonprofits continue, and the people who fund them continue to invest in organizing and in building the power and capacity of the folks who are clients of the organizations, receiving the services of the organizations most impacted by food injustice, impacted by the work of these organizations, continue like investing in these folks and their leadership and their ability to like organize their neighbors in their community and build power. And when we do that, it is more, we do have more power to push the city council, to push the mayor in the directions that we want to continue to go.
Got it. I have one, I know we have just a little bit more time, but can we talk a little bit about the role of food in healing trauma in communities as a part of justice? It's the joy of food too.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I love that question. Wow. So again, I'm affiliated with DC Greens, and we have this space called The Well in far southeast, which is like a big, urban garden space that's just like open to people. And I was actually interviewing someone yesterday who lives in Congress Heights, and who was talking about the healing that space and the food in that space provided during the pandemic. So during the pandemic, he started walking through Oxen Run Park every day. So also just access to land in general. He starts walking through Oxen Run Park every day. And then he stumbles upon a fig tree, which is something we had planted there. And that just provided their family not only with delicious figs, but with just like comfort and joy. This is somebody from Sudan. And it just reminded him of home. It was something he shared with his neighbors. He told me he also like cut off a graft of the trees. Now he has a fig tree in his backyard, right? And so, yeah, when people do have this access to food and access to land, it can absolutely just be this source of community building and joy and healing. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the amazing things I see around food are just the sharing of stories and family history, and the opportunity to bridge some of the gaps between our seniors, our elders, and young people. The farm at Kelly Miller is a great example of seeing that. We're behind the middle school, Kelly Miller Middle School, so it's like 400 students. But we have a senior garden within that space as well as a youth garden. So being able to have that interaction is really important. Also seeing that beyond the the softer parts of food, that there's hard work, and that there's labor to be valued, but opportunities as well. So being able to kind of synergistically, tie those things together for folks is something that I'm really excited about being able to communicate and do more of as we build, capacity and collaborate with others.
Yeah, and I'll just add, Chris and I were at our Food Policy Council annual retreat on Tuesday, and Chris brought up inner youth gun violence and like how the Food Policy Council could be like more proactively like figuring out like the role of food security and like the role of Food Policy Council in like addressing that crisis. And yeah, I've been, I think there's a lot of opportunity for like thinking about how like hunger and food insecurity can contribute to like heightened stress and like heightened emotions, and working more closely with like Office of Neighborhood and Safety Engagement and figuring out ways that we can also like collaborate more closely with nonprofits doing work to address youth gun violence. And, I think there's probably a lot of unexplored opportunity for collaboration there, both, for the Food Policy Council and for the city government, but also for nonprofits and funders.
Thank you. All right, so we have a little bit of time left for question and answer from the chat. What's on y'all's mind? Dan says the mention of land made me wonder, could philanthropies be useful in purchasing spaces that could then be turned over to community organizations for food development?
Yes. Yeah, sure. I mean, I think Chris and I have done like a little research on like, particularly like cooperatives, like land cooperatives, and how, that could be like explored more deeply in the city for urban agriculture. But I think it's an interesting question for like other types of community organizations. Chris and Dominique, I don't know if you want to add.
Food development, I mean, I would include in food development also like all the stages of that. I mean, the facts are we don't have time to run up extra land here in DC, and urban agriculture is important. So we want to have that. I'm always talking to elders who want to be able to grow their own food, and this is also an important space for like processing food, for example, and building relationships with farmers who live in our region and like creating, products and a market to build really a healthy like regional ecosystem. So I think it's also important to think about like, what is the role of like a city, in that ecosystem. So there's my point is there's kind of like a huge range of things that we need absolutely folks to give up some land for us to have space to do.
Right. And speaking of land, how can we pivot back to conversations about the use of DC government land and the ways in which land is, given for $1 to developers? How can we transfer that land to the hands of the farmers cultivating the land and community members and organizations who are doing that type of work?
Through advocacy. And I think, land is like really expensive in DC right now. And our friends over at the Office of Urban Agriculture have like tried as they might to, try to identify parcels of city land where they can lease for free to urban farms. It's been a really big challenge. I don't think I can really sugarcoat it. I think it's really difficult to identify parcels of land that the city is like willing to part with. I do think there's opportunity for like working with property owners to like, there are like urban agriculture property tax credits. That's only for leasing, so it's not for ownership. But like figuring out ways to at least make the land that's being developed like more friendly to like bringing in like nonprofits and local businesses. I mean, they're about to like, you know, there's plans right now to completely redevelop that New York Avenue corridor, for example. And like, that feels like we're in a moment right now, right? Of like, what is that going to look like? Will it be space where like a local business could afford a retail space? Is it a space where like there could be green space, there could be community gardens, or not? And like the city is having those conversations right now with like the developers and the property owners that control most of that corridor. So, you know, engaging with like the work that Office of Planning and the comp plan, the comprehensive plan are doing is, I think really important. And I will say like the residents of Ivy City are extremely engaged in this. And there are like community leaders who are already like deeply engaged in making sure that this continues to be a livable community. But, you know, we can all see how we can support them in that work.
Thank you. Another great question from Martha. Martha asks, Ona, is there legislation this year for support for expanding universal basic income in DC and a local child tax credit, since both have been so effective?
Yeah, not that I'm aware of on the local level. I know on the federal level, there's a lot of advocacy for an extended child tax credit. We are still pretty early in the budget process. So, I mean, transparently, I do not know what the mayor is about to do, you know, next March, but this is like the time to be organizing advocacy efforts for things like that, both, you know, towards the mayor and towards the council. I know Martha's Table, through a grant from the city, was able to do a UBI pilot for, I believe, for new mothers. But I haven't seen, I think that just happened. So seeing the results of that and then pushing for expansions of programs like that, I think would be excellent.
Thank you so much. And I think we're a little bit over time, just a tad.
Yeah, we have about 60 seconds left. So I'm just going to close this out. Thank you guys so much for joining us. And to our amazing panelists, and Chris, you as an amazing moderator. We are, very happy to see so many people engaged in this conversation, our board members, our staff. And Brad thought it was really important for us to focus on food justice during holiday helpings. Like we've heard, with the increase in demand and with inflation, bread is spending nearly 4 times more on food since the pandemic started. We went from serving 250 families a day to about 1,600. And this holiday helpings, we exceeded our goal of serving 12,000 families and served 16,000 on the last day. And so we are still in the process of covering those costs for holiday helpings. We've raised $1.25 million to serve the 16,000 families of our 1.6 million. And we couldn't have done it without the people on this call, our staff, our supporters, our donors. And we know we can't do this work without you. So if you feel moved to donate to Bread today, we will drop a link in the chat. And our next Breaking Bread, this is a series. So our next one is tentatively scheduled for Thursday, February 23rd at 1 p.m. And that will focus on our social services department and what they're doing to close the racial wealth gap when it comes to it's more focused on economic justice. So thank you guys for coming, and I will be dropping our donation link in the chat.